Welcome to the debate. Imagine for a second that you rely on a sprawling, vital highway system every single day just to get to work, to get your family home safely, to live your life.
Right, a system we all essentially depend on.
Exactly. But this highway is completely chaotic. It's littered with 50 different private toll booths.
And some lanes require a special currency you don't even have.
Right. Detour signs lead to dead ends, and millions of people simply can't afford the toll, so they're just stranded on the shoulder. When infrastructure is that broken, you face a fundamental choice. Do you keep patching the potholes and adding more confusing intersections, or do you tear the whole thing up and lay down a streamlined, high-speed rail line in its place?
The problem with tearing up the highway, though, is that you still need to get to work tomorrow.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, if that new high-speed train derails on its very first run and you've already demolished the road, you're left with nothing.
Exactly. And that tension is what brings us to today's topic. We are pulling a critical question straight from our source material. Would a single-payer healthcare system actually work, or would it fundamentally fail if adopted by the United States?
And the stakes here are just astronomical.
They really are. I mean, the U.S. currently spends $5.3 trillion on healthcare. That is nearly a fifth of our entire gross domestic product.
Which is staggering.
It is. Yet, despite being the wealthiest nation in human history, we have millions of citizens who are entirely uninsured or dangerously underinsured. So we're asking if transitioning to a government-financed single-payer model would finally untangle this mess, or if it would introduce a completely different set of macroeconomic disasters.
Right.
I look at the data and see a single-payer system that would absolutely work by eliminating staggering administrative waste, leveraging international reference pricing to control runaway costs, and ultimately saving over $1 trillion and 114,000 lives annually.
And I look at that exact same structural overhaul and see a system that would fail upon adoption because the immense tax burden required for financing would contract the U.S. GDP by up to 10%, while severe provider payment cuts would constrain the medical supply and trigger unmanageable wait times.
So to really understand why a structural overhaul is necessary, we have to look at how uniquely punishing the current multi-payer framework is. I mean, it is punishing to the average person.
It definitely is.
Yeah, this isn't just an abstract economic spreadsheet, It's a reality where 66.5% of all personal bankruptcies in the United States are tied directly to medical expenses.
That is just a devastating statistic.
It really is, especially when you look across the border to Canada, where that number drops to 19%. In the UK, it's just 8.2%.
Wow.
And the root of this financial toxicity in the U.S. isn't that our doctors are doing drastically different procedures. It's our administrative bloat. U.S. insurers and providers spend 34.2% of national health expenditures purely on administration.
Just on paperwork, essentially.
Exactly. We're talking about armies of people whose entire job is to code bills, deny claims, and fight over prior authorizations. That breaks down to $2,497 per capita, which is double the 17% rate they have in Canada. Adopting a single-payer system works by just taking a wrecking ball to that fragmented blow.
I don't disagree that the current system has deep, painful flaws. The administrative waste is very real.
Right.
But a single-payer model would fail in the specific domestic context of the United States because you can't just isolate the healthcare sector from the rest of the economy. I'm looking at the Congressional Budget Office analysis, which explicitly models this.
Okay, what did they say?
Well, shifting all that private health spending to the public ledger requires fully financing the system via new payroll or income taxes. The CBO indicates this massive shift would cause the U.S. GDP to shrink by 1 to 10% by 2030.
But those macroeconomic projections often overlook the massive efficiencies gained. When you run the epidemiological and economic projections, especially considering we'd be saving $1.041 trillion annually system-wide, the math actually balances out beautifully.
It balances on paper, yeah, but economies are made of human beings, and human behavior changes when you alter the rules.
How so?
Well, there is a behavioral economic reality we have to face here called the substitution effect. Think about what happens when you eliminate premiums and deductibles.
People have more money.
Exactly.
When Americans no longer pay those out-of-pocket costs from their paychecks, their disposable income effectively goes up. They experience a wealth effect.
Which sounds like a massive benefit to the working class.
It is a benefit to them personally, but macroeconomically it changes their behavior. When people feel wealthier, they substitute that extra wealth for leisure. They choose to work fewer hours.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Right. Older workers who might have stayed in the labor force purely to keep their employer-sponsored health insurance suddenly retire early. So you have a labor force reduction happening at the exact same time you are imposing heavy new payroll and income taxes to fund the federal subsidies, and those subsidies jump to nearly 10% of GDP.
That combination, less labor supply plus massive new taxes, is exactly what contracts the overall American economy. You might fix the healthcare ledger, but you shrink the entire economy to do it.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, mostly because it frames a profound social victory as an economic catastrophe.
A social victory?
Yes, because you're talking about job lock. If a 62-year-old worker is only staying in a physically demanding job because they are terrified of losing their health insurance before Medicare kicks in, well, freeing them from that coercion is a feature of single payer, not a bug.
From a human perspective, yes, absolutely. From the perspective of funding a $5.3 trillion system, losing that worker's tax base is a structural problem.
But we aren't just losing tax base without gaining massive capital back. Let's look closer at how those administrative savings actually fund the system.
Okay.
By simply consolidating the billing and insurance functions down to the administrative level of our current Medicare program, we recovered $286.3 billion annually.
That's a huge number.
It is, and add to that another $285.7 billion recovered by reducing fraudulent billing through a unified claim system. It goes back to that highway metaphor from earlier.
The toll booths.
Right. Our current multi-payer system is like a road choked by 50 different toll booths, each demanding a different currency with clerks arguing in different languages. A single-payer system just bulldozes the toll booths. The traffic, the economy moves faster.
I come at it from a different way. While the health sector might look perfectly clean and efficient on a spreadsheet without those toll booths, you are completely ignoring what happens to the broader economy when you change how the road is funded in the first place.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm ignoring.
But you can bulldoze the toll booths, and you still have to pay for the asphalt. And if a massive chunk of your workforce has retired because they no longer have job lock, who is paying the income taxes for that asphalt?
The overall economic burden on households still decreases. Yes, taxes go up, but they are entirely offset by the elimination of private premiums, copays, and deductibles.
For some, maybe.
For the vast majority of Americans, actually, their net take-home pay after healthcare costs goes up. Furthermore, the economic modeling clearly shows that a healthier population is a more productive population. People aren't missing work because they can't afford their insulin.
That's fair.
But if we're questioning whether the math adds up on the financing side, we have to look at the other side of the ledger, how the system pays for actual medical goods and services. Because this is where the real leverage of single payer comes in.
Right, and this is exactly where I see the system breaking the supply chain of care.
Well, let me lay out the mechanism first. Right now, a hospital charges a private insurer significantly more than it charges Medicare for the exact same procedure. Applying those lower Medicare payment rates universally across all providers saves $295.6 billion instantly.
Which is a massive pay cut for providers.
And then there are pharmaceuticals. If we implement something called external reference pricing, we save another $377.5 billion.
For listeners who might not be familiar with the exact mechanics of that, how is that reference pricing actually calculated?
It's actually beautifully simple. Right now, the U.S. essentially accepts whatever price pharmaceutical companies demand, which is why we pay nearly 4 times higher than similar countries for the exact same drugs.
True.
External reference pricing just means we cluster 5 to 7 comparable developed countries, say Germany, France, the UK. We look at the average ex-factory price they pay for a drug and legally cap our price at that average.
So tying it to European markets, essentially?
Yeah. The European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations already operates with similar standards, We just align the U.S. with the rest of the developed world.
That's a compelling argument. And, capping drug prices is incredibly popular. But have you considered the immediate supply-side shock of those price controls? Specifically on the hospitals and doctors, you're talking about applying Medicare payment rates to all providers universally?
Which standardizes a system.
It standardizes a pay cut. The Urban Institute issued severe warnings about this exact mechanism. Right now, hospitals rely on a system of cross-subsidization.
Meaning they charge private insurers more to cover the Medicare shortfall.
Exactly. Because Medicare and Medicaid frequently pay less than the actual cost of delivering care, hospitals charge private insurers significantly more to make up the difference and keep their doors open.
Right. If you eliminate private insurance and enforce strict Medicare-level payment rates universally, you risk a drastic reduction in the supply of care. Physicians and hospitals are suddenly facing severe revenue cuts across the board without the private market to balance the books.
But they won't have to deal with the billing bloat.
Even so, if they can't cover overhead, providers might simply opt out, retire early, or shut down entire departments. I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. We are talking about a systemic overhaul that projects a net saving of $1.041 trillion annually, while simultaneously expanding comprehensive care to 27.5 million completely uninsured Americans, plus tens of millions more who are currently underinsured.
But expanding access doesn't create more doctors.
We are projecting over 114,000 lives saved annually. That massive expansion of life-saving access fundamentally proves the viability of the system. You don't save 114,000 lives that the hospitals are closing.
But you're pointing to the expansion of access, which brings up the reality of waiting lines. Proponents of the current U.S. system frequently point to our relatively short wait times for non-emergency surgeries compared to countries like Canada or the UK.
Yeah, I've read that.
But if you dig into the data, it reveals a fairly dark truth. The U.S. currently enjoys short wait times primarily because our lack of universal access artificially depresses the demand.
Precisely. Because millions of people simply can't afford to get in line.
Right. There is an invisible, infinite waiting line for the millions of uninsured and underinsured Americans who simply never enter the healthcare system. They ration their own care by staying home.
Which is a brutal indictment of the current system.
It is. But here is the structural trap for a single-payer system. If you suddenly inject millions of new patients into the system, you convert that invisible, infinite wait into actual physical demand.
Right. They show up to the clinic.
Exactly. And you are doing this at the exact moment that you've slashed provider payments to Medicare levels, which shrinks provider capacity. If you don't have a corresponding expansion of doctors, nurses, and hospital beds to handle those new patients,
you get a bottleneck.
Worse, the system risks infinite, highly visible waiting lines for everyone. You are simultaneously maximizing the demand for care while capping the financial incentive to supply it. It's a recipe for a supply chain collapse.
But that implies our current provider capacity is perfectly efficient right now, which we absolutely know it isn't, given the $286.3 billion in administrative bloat we are removing.
Sure, but
think about how doctors spend their days right now. If providers are spending significantly less time fighting on the phone with private insurance companies over prior authorizations, and their billing departments are cut in half, they have drastically more time to actually see patients.
I don't know if that completely offsets it, though.
Capacity isn't just about the number of doctors, you know? It's about how much time those doctors are allowed to practice medicine instead of practicing administration.
Freeing up a few hours a week of administrative time isn't going to double a surgeon's capacity to do knee replacements, especially when their overall revenue just dropped by 20%.
Well, if we want to talk about where capacity is truly failing, let's look beyond the theoretical and transition into geographic realities. How would a federal single-payer model actually function on the ground, particularly in rural America? Because the free market is currently destroying rural health.
In what sense?
In a market-driven system like ours, small rural hospitals are failing at a catastrophic rate because they rely on per-patient billing. If a town only has 5,000 people, the hospital simply has low patient volumes.
Right. There just aren't enough people.
Exactly. They can't cover their fixed overhead. The MRI machine costs the same to run whether it sees 2 patients a day or 20.
Under a single-payer system, the government utilizes something called global budgeting.
Meaning they get a lump sum?
Exactly. Instead of billing per patient, the government gives the hospital a set, guaranteed budget for the year. This prioritizes universal access over operational efficiency. It keeps those vital rural facilities viable regardless of their daily patient volume. We see this working successfully in Canada, where their single-payer model actively protects rural infrastructure.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are assuming the United States can seamlessly implement centralized global budgeting across a highly decentralized, heavily politicized landscape.
I think it's possible.
We have to look at the concept of uncooperative federalism.
And how does that apply here?
Uncooperative federalism is what happens when state or subnational governments aggressively resist and undermine federal mandates. Even in Canada, their single-payer system is not actually a single national program run out of Ottawa.
Right. It's run by the provinces.
It leaves the 13 provinces to independently manage and deliver care. And the data shows that Canada still profoundly struggles with a rural health penalty, with massive disparities in care outside major cities. Now map that onto the US, and the problem multiplies exponentially.
Because of our 50 states.
Exactly. We have 50 states that have historically shown aggressive, partisan resistance to federal healthcare incursions. Just look at how many states actively fought and refused Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act, even when the federal government was footing almost the entire bill.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. Even with the friction of federalism, how can a system be considered a failure if it's the only model proven to prioritize the survival of rural health infrastructure over corporate efficiency?
Well,
Global budgeting, even if implemented imperfectly across different states, is far superior to letting rural hospitals die one by one in a free market vacuum.
but the federal government in the U.S. lacks the precise mechanisms to force rural health equity onto uncooperative states. A U.S. single-payer system wouldn't look like this perfectly tuned uniform machine that you're describing.
It wouldn't be perfect, no.
It would likely resemble a massively expanded Medicaid program plagued by 50 fragmented, highly politicized state-level implementations. You'd have states setting different rules, resisting federal mandates, fighting over budget allocations, and ultimately failing to deliver the uniform standard of care the single-payer model promises.
There would be growing pains.
The Canadian experience shows us that even with a deep cultural commitment to healthcare as a human right, decentralized implementation creates massive regional disparities. Here in the U.S., it would be a logistical nightmare.
The fact that regional disparities might persist does not invalidate the foundational superiority of the single-payer model. We have to weigh these potential implementation frictions against the catastrophic, documented failure of our current status quo.
So to summarize your position?
Yeah, to pull my perspective together in light of this exchange, the current multi-payer model is structurally untenable. We cannot accept a system that produces 114,000 preventable deaths annually because people are locked out of care.
Right.
We cannot accept a system that subjects our citizens to a 66.5% medical bankruptcy rate. We are burning hundreds of billions of dollars every single year in administrative waste and artificially inflated drug prices. A single-payer system's efficiency, specifically by bulldozing the administrative blow and utilizing international referencing pricing, offer a viable, workable, rational path forward to save both trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives.
And to bring my perspective into focus, while I deeply acknowledge the painful flaws of the current model and the invisible waiting line of the uninsured is a tragedy, adopting a single-payer system would fundamentally fail to map on to the American economic and political reality.
Because of the macroeconomics.
Precisely. The macroeconomic consequences are simply too severe. We're looking at a GDP contraction of up to 10%, driven by massive new taxation and a substitution effect that reduces our labor force. When you combine that economic drag with the supply-side constraints caused by slashing provider revenues and inject the inevitable, messy friction of uncooperative federalism across 50 highly partisan states, you are left with a system that breaks under its own weight.
I think we have reached a very clear point of convergence here, though. We both look at the empirical data and agree that the current U.S. healthcare trajectory is deeply flawed and requires profound structural intervention.
The optimal framework remains fiercely contested, but the status quo is indefensible.
I completely agree with that. It really comes down to the lens through which you view the reform. If you view it purely through a micro-level lens of patient access and immediate individual financial relief, single-payer looks like an absolute triumph.
It really does.
But if you zoom out to a macro-level lens of economic stability, labor supply dynamics, and institutional supply chains, the structural cracks become terrifyingly apparent. Our source material definitely holds deeper insights into alternative frameworks, perhaps hybrid models that might bridge this gap.
Indeed. We started this conversation talking about a massive, complicated highway system. We know the current road is deeply broken. It's full of potholes, and it is littered with 50 different incredibly expensive toll booths that leave millions of people stranded.
It's a mess.
The question remains whether tearing it all up to build a high-speed rail line will finally get everyone to their destination safely and efficiently, or whether the massive cost and disruption of that construction will bring the entire economy to a grinding halt before the first train ever leaves the station. We will leave that for you to decide.